You don't just have trust issues. That explanation is too clean, too convenient, almost like it's designed to end the conversation before it starts. Because if you actually observe yourself closely, you'll notice something strange. You don't struggle to trust everyone. You only struggle at very specific moments. Moments that feel normal on the outside, but change something internally for you. Right when someone starts to matter, right when the interaction stops being casual, something shifts inside you. Not loudly, not dramatically, almost silently, like a decision gets made without your permission. And the most unsettling part, it doesn't feel like fear. It feels like clarity. But what if that clarity is not what you think it is? Most people assume trust is about the other person. Are they honest? Are they stable? Are they safe? That's the surface layer your mind shows you. But underneath that layer, your brain is running a completely different calculation, one you don't consciously notice. It's not asking, can I trust them? It's asking, what changes in me if I let this go further? And here's where things get interesting. Because whatever you think this pattern is, it might not actually be about trust at all. In fact, calling it trust issues might be the first misdirection your mind created. And if that's true, then the real reason is something you haven't fully looked at yet. Not because it's hidden from you, but because it only becomes visible at a certain emotional distance. And most people never reach that distance long enough to notice it. You can trust people without hesitation in everyday life. You trust systems. You trust timing. You trust strangers to behave predictably in public. So clearly, your brain understands trust. It knows how to use it. But there's a threshold where everything changes. Not because trust disappears, but because something else enters the equation. Exposure. And exposure changes the entire meaning of risk. Because now, it's not about what happens externally. It's about what gets affected internally. And that shift is so subtle. Most people never notice when it happens. They just feel it. A small tightening, a pause, a recalibration. And then they tell themselves, I just don't trust people easily. But that explanation is incomplete. And the missing part is where everything starts to split. There's a very specific moment this pattern activates, not at the beginning of connection, not during casual interaction. It happens later, when someone starts to understand you without effort, when you don't have to explain yourself as much, when the connection starts to feel natural. That's where the shift happens, and it's subtle enough that you might miss it in real time. You don't reject them. You don't pull away immediately. Instead, you adjust, slightly, quietly. You start interpreting things differently. You start scanning tone more carefully. You start holding parts of yourself back without deciding to. And from the outside, nothing has changed. But internally, distance has already been created. And the question is not why you do this, but what exactly your mind thinks is about to happen next. Because it's not reacting to the present moment. It's reacting to something it predicts, something it learned long before this situation ever existed. Here's where most people misunderstand themselves. Your mind is not actually reacting to the other person. Not really. The other person is just the trigger. The real reaction is happening somewhere else entirely, inside you. To something you don't want to experience again. Rejection, misinterpretation, emotional loss, or something harder to define. That feeling of opening up too far and not being able to take it back. But even that is not the deepest layer, because underneath those experiences, there is usually a single quiet assumption forming in the background. If I let this go too far, I might not recover from what I feel afterward. And once that assumption exists, your mind doesn't wait for proof. It starts preventing scenarios before they fully form, not because it is afraid of people, but because it is trying to avoid a specific internal outcome, one it has already labeled as dangerous. This is where the pattern becomes more visible. You don't cut people off. You don't fully disconnect. Instead, you maintain a controlled emotional distance, close enough to feel connection, far enough to avoid vulnerability overload. And over time, this becomes your default relationship structure. Not consciously, not intentionally, it just feels stable. But stability comes at a cost, because you are now constantly balancing two opposite forces: the pull toward connection and the instinct to regulate exposure. And neither side fully wins until one starts becoming slightly stronger over time, not because it is correct, but because it is practiced more often. And that's where the shift becomes permanent. At some point in your past, there was a moment your system didn't fully process in real time. It might not have been dramatic, it might not have been obvious, but emotionally, something registered. A mismatch between expectation and outcome. A moment where openness felt costly. And your mind did something very efficient in response. It learned a rule, not in words, but in behavior. Don't go all the way in again. And the important part is not the event itself, but the conclusion your nervous system attached to it. Because once that rule exists, it doesn't stay tied to the past. It starts projecting into the future, quietly, automatically, without asking for permission. And that's when a personality begins to form around protection instead of expression. The most convincing part of this pattern is how natural it feels. It doesn't feel like something you're doing. It feels like something you are. Cautious, selective, observant, independent. And because it feels stable, you rarely question it. But there's a subtle contradiction hidden inside it. Because if this was truly your fixed nature, it would have been there from the beginning. But it wasn't. There was a time before this pattern became automatic, which means it wasn't always you. It became you. And anything that becomes learned can also be examined. But the idea of examining it feels like removing protection before you're sure what replaces it. And that uncertainty is exactly what keeps the pattern alive. So maybe the real story was never about trust issues. Maybe it was about something more specific, a system built to prevent emotional experiences from repeating in the same way again. And it has worked very well. But every protection system has a side effect, because the same mechanism that filters out emotional risk also reduces emotional depth. Not completely, but enough to be noticeable in quiet moments. Moments where things feel close, but not fully open, connected, but slightly restricted. And that creates a subtle tension most people can't name. So the real question is not whether you can trust people. It's something quieter than that. What version of yourself had to stay controlled for this level of protection to keep working? And if that control softened, even slightly, what kind of experiences would start becoming possible again? Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, in a way you would notice before you fully understand it. And that might be the first time the pattern stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like a choice.